indirectly visit us, and that's Richard's subject of talk, in fact, which I'm looking forward to hearing. And I also emphasize the point that's already been made, that 1 month statistics may look very discouraging, and one should take that into account because it's a signal. But a month statistics is a month statistics and no more, and we have to look at the bigger picture that lies behind. And in this bigger picture, India may be missing some very important ladders, which I will come to, and to this I must return. But the fact that we have avoided the Pied Piper of snake charming must be something to celebrate. But what are the ladders? I turn now to that. We are missing out, even as we dodge the snakes. Fast economic growth of GNP contributes to development, not merely through raising the incomes of people, but very powerfully through generating public revenue. Thank you very much. In fact, public revenue very often goes much faster than the GNP. The price-adjusted public revenue in India today seems to be about 4 times what it used to be merely 20 years ago, a much faster expansion than even the fast-growing gross domestic product. But there are important contrasts in the way different countries are using the growing basket of public revenue, and related to that, contrast in what priorities does the political system and economic concerns give to the different issues involved in where India ought to emerge. To take a classic contrast, that between China and India, India may be now growing almost as fast as China, but China seems to be making much greater use of this opportunity for development purposes. For example, government expenditure on healthcare, not total expenditure, government expenditure on healthcare in China is nearly 5 times that in India. China does, of course, have a larger population and a higher per capita income than India. But even in relative terms, China spends a much higher proportion of the GDP on government expenditure in healthcare, about between 1.5 to twice as much as India as a percentage of GDP. The allocation of government expenditure is in itself extremely important. But more than that, it also serves as an indicator of how much priority the country, its government, and ultimately its political system gives to concerns such as quality of life and the development of human capabilities of the people. Even though India is now growing nearly as rapidly as China in terms of GDP, the gap between the two countries has been growing rather than diminishing quite fast in terms of values of most social indicators of living standard, such as life expectancy, infant mortality, mean years of schooling, the coverage of immunization, and so on. Jean Drèze and I have a comparative paper in the Outlook, which I believe in abridged form will come out in Year Journal, about comparing India with other countries. It's called Putting Growth in Its Place. That came out a couple of months ago in the Outlook. To comment on the last, immunization, 97% of the Chinese children are immunized with the DPT triple vaccine, in contrast with India's meager figure of 66%. However, it's not merely China, but even contrasted with our neighbors in South Asia, India's relative position has sharply declined compared with Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and even Bhutan. In fact, we used to be 20 years ago, between first or second next to Sri Lanka in the 6 South Asian country comparison. Our rank was 1 or 2. Our rank now is 5 or 6, actually it's mainly 5. And thank God for Pakistan, since Pakistan is the face saver for India in that respect. And since I have a lot of Pakistani friends, great sympathy with it, I wish that Pakistan hadn't been such an example to boost Indian self-confidence. On the other hand, the contrast with Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka of course, doesn't come through at all well. Bangladesh may be blessed with an active NGO movement that is a world beater, in addition to a restored democracy. And Bangladeshi women seem to have been more mobilized for the cause of economic and social and political change in a way that India has not been able to match. Bangladesh, to my best of my knowledge, is the only country in the world there are more girls in school than there are boys. It's a feat that we don't come anywhere near these. These ladders, however, are available to India also and to all other countries if we take the objectives of good quality of life and development of human capability as seriously as I believe it should. Of course, development involves more than social indicators, which receive the bulk of the attention these days. Since I was privileged to have the opportunity of assisting my visionary friend and dear departed friend, Mahbub al-Haq, in developing the human development approach, I'm delighted that the variables on which the approach focuses, such as life expectancy, literacy, and so on, tend to get a lot of attention these days in the development literature, including in the identification of Millennium Development Goals. These are indeed important indicators of quality of life. But they are not the only things of importance for development, as Mahbub al-Haq would have been the first to acknowledge. As was articulated by the Millennium Declaration, not to be confused with Millennium Development Goals, announced the year before that, in 2000, adopted by the UN in the year 2000, well before the Millennium Development Goals, there are other aspects of development as well, including democracy and human rights. Economic growth may not be especially effective in advancing these additional objectives of development, but in our policy making, we have to be particularly careful that these broader objectives of development are not neglected or undermined in the pursuit of other causes, even social indicators. For example, the largely successful practice of democracy in India cannot be regarded as irrelevant to the quality of life of Indians. The interest in political and social participation seems to stretch even to the poorest part of the Indian population today. An adequate understanding of the quality of life requires us to go well beyond the variables on which the human development indicators or Millennium Development Goals concentrate. These recognitions raise another question. Could it be that India's democratic system is a barrier to using the fruits of economic growth for the purpose of enhancing health, education, and other features of social development? In addressing the question in an essay in the New York Review of Books, published earlier this year, I confess to having a sense of nostalgia here. When India had a very low rate of economic growth, as was the case until the 1980s, a common argument coming from the critics of democracy was that democracy was hostile to fast economic growth. It was hard for us, on the other side, on the pro-democracy side, to convince the anti-democratic advocates that fast economic growth depends on the friendliness of the economic climate rather than on the fierceness of the political system. That debate on the contradiction between democracy and economic growth has now ended, not least because of the high economic growth of democratic India. But a similar skepticism about democracy seems to be emerging, dealing with the alleged inability of democratic systems to pursue public health, public education, and other socially supportive arrangements. Relatively authoritarian systems have the advantage of being able to change quickly their policies when the leaders want that to happen. And it is to the huge credit of the Chinese political leaders that they focus so much on social intervention in education, healthcare, and other supportive mechanisms to advance the quality of life of the Chinese people. And there is a lot for us to learn from there. But authoritarianism does not, of course, provide any kind of guarantee that the social commitment will undoubtedly emerge or be sustained. We only have to look at North Korea or Myanmar or Burma to understand that. And there is, in fact, no real barrier, and that's the positive point, in combining multi-party democratic government with growth-mediated development. As the technical economists say, they're orthogonal to each other, but in fact we have to see how they are linked causally. But what would be needed is much greater public engagement in the central demands of justice and development through more vigorous democratic practice, what Walter Bagehot and John Stuart Mill saw as, I quote, government by discussion. The history of the emergence of the welfare state in Europe provides, with some ups and downs, quite a robust example of this, how an active public was in charge of social progress that came about through the emergence of the welfare system. Those were the glory days, of course, of Europe. Rather a contrast from now. Coming back to India, public debate is very powerful in India, but the range of engagement has often been quite limited. The India-China comparisons tend to concentrate mostly on the horse race of relative rates of overall growth of GDP, rather than the variations in the pursuit of development. Underlying this dialogic narrowness, there is a social picture. A big part of the Indian population, a fairly small minority, but still quite large in absolute numbers, maybe a couple of 100 million, has been doing very well indeed through the process of high growth alone. They do not depend on social mediation. In contrast, more vigorous mediation would be very important for other Indians, many more, many hundreds of millions more, who have various deprivation, sometimes of great severity. Some are even undernourished, unschooled, and medically uncared. The gains of those who have done well are, of course, positive achievement, and there is nothing wrong in celebrating their better lives. But an exaggerated concentration on their lives, fed partly by media interests, gives an unreal picture of the rosiness of what's happening to the Indians in general. And this not help to broaden the public dialogue. Since the fortunate group includes not only business leaders and the professional classes, but also the bulk of the country's intellectuals, the story of unusual national advancement gets wide and persistently aired. There is a strong need for determined broadening of the democratic political agenda. And so there is for changing the rhetoric of China-India comparison from an obsession with comparative growth rates of GNP to the contrasting achievement in the quality of life, from those in education, healthcare, nourishment, immunization, to the practice of democracy and the safeguarding of personal and political liberties. Given the nature of Indian democratic politics, a social concern can become effective only by making it an integral part of the democratic process, including media discussion and political debates. That is happening at long last with the recognition of corruption as a big issue, even though the temptation to try to deal with it through summary means that weaken our democratic system also carries some dangers. But despite that, it is basically a positive development. However, this has to happen, this broadening has to happen over a much wider and larger front with which my second part of my paper has been concerned. So to conclude then, it's good that we have been successfully dodging the snakes that seem to be playing havoc with a huge part of the world today, not unrelated to what I believe is confused economic thinking. But we also have to be more vigilant in spotting and using the ladders that make the challenge of development so important and so exciting. Democratic public dialogue needs broadening in clarifying where we want to emerge as we continue our process of development. There are few things as important today in India as the nature and reach of public discussion and the priorities that should guide us in determining where we do want to emerge in democratic India. So that is my little bit on snakes and ladders that I want to present to the discussion in this symposium this morning. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Amartya. We now move to our second distinguished speaker. I have great pleasure in introducing to you Professor Richard Freeman. He's one of the leading labor economists in the country, as the finance minister has already pointed out. He holds the Herbert Asherman Chair in Economics at Harvard University and is the co-director of the Labor and Work-Life Program at the Harvard Law School and a visiting professor at the London School of Economics and program director for labor studies at the National Bureau of Economic Research. Professor Freeman has several awards and honors to his credit, like the Eisner Prize in Labor Economics, the Mincer Lifetime Achievement Prize, and other awards. Professor Freeman is going to speak on, can emerging economies insulate themselves from the weaknesses of the advanced economies and keep growing? Professor Freeman.
There it is. Okay, got it on the screen. So I'll just make it big. There we go. Okay. Thank you. And it's a great pleasure to be here and to discuss with you what I think is the giant topic for the emerging economies. The advanced world has shown itself to be much weaker and not as healthy and does not offer as good a system as one thought any number of years ago. And so that's the question. I use the term in this, insulate, as different from isolate, because I think there is no isolation for anybody in the world. But if your neighbors are getting sick, you do want to insulate yourself with some medicines to take care of yourself. And